Absolutely loving the background of my guest on this episode, talking with author Craig Cormick. And Craig, you have a lovely display behind you that sort of illustrates some of your connection to the visual, the written word with demoniacs. And I'll also mention a few other works. I know that you've worked in historical sort of writing as well, but you also have the Shadow Master series, as well as a number of other works that are out. So glad to have you and glad to talk about the written word today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for saying yes to the invitation. And you and I have already been talking about some of the ethos of the show and the things that I'm interested in as a teacher and as somebody that occasionally writes myself. Um, Curious about your connection to reading and writing and creating and how that happened for you.
So when I was young, my dad had a news agency, which is a paper shop or a shop that sells books and newspapers and so on. And me and my twin brother and my younger and elder brother, four of us, four boys,
Hmm.
we really loved comics. And this is back in the classic era, with the early Superman, Batman. And we really learnt reading from reading comics. After that, we graduated and moved on to, books and fantasy books and history books, and we'd read anything. And we had a couple of seminal moments I can recall in my life. And one was we had a little tiny library near our house. And one day we were in that library, me and my two of my three brothers were in there, and the school bully was there. And we thought, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. The school bully's seen us. And he comes over and says, hey, you kids, you. And we thought, uh-oh. And he said, you like reading? And we thought, he's going to, rip into us for being keen readers. And we said,
Hmm.
yeah, we like reading. And he said, read this. And he gave us a copy of Lord of the Rings. And
Nice.
turned out to be, we passed around, we were racing between us. Wait, finish that book, my turn, my turn. Next chapter, you give it to me. And it was a strange moment to find that this kid who was a bit socially isolated, a bit of a bully, he was a fascinating fantasy reader. And
Yeah.
he passed us on to Lord of the Rings. And that made a connection between us and him. And you realized from that moment that reading didn't need to be a solitary act.
Uh-huh.
Reading can connect you, not just the reader and the writer, but there are other connections. And over my writing life, I've now come sort of full circle. I've gone through, written, I don't know, 40 something books like children. After 20, you lose track of how many you've got.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm moving back into looking to the graphics again now, which is where I started off when I was teaching myself to read through comics.
Love that. That there's a lot that you said there that I really enjoy. The idea of teaching yourself to read through comics is really interesting, but then that's also maybe the best school bully story that I've ever heard as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And that leads a little bit to the second question, which is the kinds of stories that you're drawn to, because I've noticed this fantasy sort of motif in your work as well. So it sounds like catching comics and Lord of the Rings was something that stuck with you.
Yeah, it has. And if I'm asked to, what type of books do I like to read and what do I like to engage with in my writing, I've got on the wall in my study here the quote from Franz Kafka: "They books need to be the axe to the frozen sea inside us. Books
Mm-hmm.
need to grab and engage." And I've thought a lot about this because in my professional life I've been a science communicator. I've done a lot of analysis of why story and narrative work the way they do.
Hmm.
And it's, what does metaphor do? How do we work on metaphor at a neurological level? What is it about? They've put people in MRI machines and read stories to them and watch the way the parts of their brains switch on and how they connect. And then they did one study, they put a person in the MRI machine reading the story, graphed her brain, and then put people there listening to the story and graphed her brain. And the same parts of the brain were lighting up. So we realize narrative and storytelling is something that's hardwired into us. And there's
Hmm.
theories that, ever since the earliest days of cavemen, when we sat around in the caves and we explained the world through story, through narrative, we explained where the stars came from. We explained why you don't go outside at dark. We explained which types of animals, why they behaved like they did. That's how we understood the world. I think we still understand the world most when we relate through story. And those stories that really get inside and hit you become that axe to that frozen sea. They're working not just at your here, but they're working here and here
Hmm.
at the same time.
Yeah, I think he just tapped into maybe the history and the origins of the horror and thriller story, where that genre comes from.
Yeah.
And this is why we don't go out at night. Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned that you have a background in sciences and that you engage in analysis. How does your work interact with that, or does it interact with that in any way? Do you sort of keep parts of your work separate in that way?
Well, I used to think I was keeping them separate.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
used to think, okay, that's my science communications part of my brain, and that's my historical nonfiction, and this is my fiction and my fantasy fiction. I used to think they were all categorized, but I've come to realize they're a bit like a Venn diagram that overlaps in many places. And there's a lot of things happening in the same places. And in the last couple of years, a lot of science institutions have had artists in residence, whether it's poets, writers, painters, musicians, because fundamentally scientists and artists, authors are trying to do a lot of the same thing. They're trying to find a truth. They're trying to distill a truth out of something large, understand why and how
Hmm.
and what. And, the best books are there. You ask, why do people write? Why do people read? You're trying to understand something of the larger world through narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that. Love it. I think we have time. We're going at a nice pace here, so I'll just take an extra question if that's okay. And
Mm.
it's sort of the Ray Bradbury question of where do your ideas come from, and then how do you sort of process them from there?
Oh, look, ideas come from everywhere.
Mm.
And I think another analogy, a science analogy, Fleming, who's credited with inventing penicillin, said one day, he laid out all these different petri dishes and things, and he found bacteria growing on these dishes, except for one. And he said the spores had come in from an orange, I think it was. And he said he spent 20 years waiting for that moment, that receptive moment. And it's about being receptive. If your mind is receptive to these things, you find them everywhere. And they
Mm.
come at you from incidents, they come at you from interactions with people, they come at you from books you read. There's a poem I remember reading about an author. She was driving along and she's talking about the feeling that she feels a poem coming.
Hmm.
And it's this
Hmm.
urge, and it's like you look up and you notice the clouds look different today. The weather looks different today. You're sharper and more acute in everything you're looking at. And I think that's part of that receptiveness. And then stories sort of sneak up on you, and or it's a mystery you're trying to figure out. So
Yeah.
demoniacs was a study of evil in the world. Where does evil come from?
Hmm.
How do you define good, evil? What are those fundamentals?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, with your work in mind, I was curious about, you mentioned comics and kind of coming full circle with that. So curious about the work that you're doing now. What has your creative focus? And do you have a relationship with IPI? Is that right?
Yeah, IPI,
Mm-hmm.
the also the IFWG/IPI have
Yeah.
published
Yeah.
my latest work here, it's a bit experimental because it's a mix of prose, and every second chapter is, as you see on the screen there, these graphic
Hmm.
written pieces, not quite comic, but not quite not. Um, we don't know quite what to call it, vignettes or illustrated novels or whatever, as an interplay, because we know younger people particularly, the capacity for graphic illustrative material to understand the world. So we've got every second chapter like this style, and we'll see how it works.
Yeah, I love that. I love how there's room to play and sort of hybridize text in that
Mm,
way, and
mm.
really enjoy that approach. And as you said, it's a full circle with your origins in comics as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
also what I've done here is mix fiction and non-fiction. So I've got a mainstream story, urban fantasy, a woman, Evie, who has these special powers. But
Hmm.
these every second chapters are actually taken from modern history. So they're acts of terror, they're acts of war, they're acts of industrial accidents. But I've reset them all in the USA.
Hmm.
So, for instance, the one above there is the attacks on Mumbai that happened some years back, where a group of terrorists came into Mumbai and took over a hotel. And we can watch that in the news and we can understand it. That when I say this happened in Illinois, or this happened in Washington State, or this happened in Tennessee, it changes the way the reader thinks of it. It
Hmm.
changes it from a fantasy notion of fiction, non-fiction. Yeah, yeah, it happened over there in India or Iran or Iraq or Germany or Sweden. But suddenly to say, no, no, it happened here in the
Hmm.
States for a reader, it reacts differently the way you concept and the way you work on the story.
Yeah, yeah, and brings it to sort of that closeness, the reality, and
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
and that narrative needs to be. We know from neuroscience studies, narrative works when it's personalized,
Hmm.
when the reader figures, hey, hey, this is about me. Why did a whole generation engage with Catcher in the Rye? A whole
Hmm.
nother generation engage with the vampires and werewolf stories, the Harry Potter stories, and
Yeah.
felt this is about me at some extent. I can see myself here.
Yeah. And there's still that something about Holden Caulfield's voice still continues to connect.
Mm,
Maybe not with everybody, but
yeah.
uh, I have students that continue to enjoy that voice. Yeah. So if I'm a reader out there and I want to know sort of what's next, what's in the creative path, the plans that you have, as well as places where I might go to connect and see more about demoniacs and your work from the past and work to come.
So you can jump on my website, which is craigcormick.com.
Hmm.
Very simple
Hmm.
one. And I have a list of all my different books. And so I write across lots of different genres. I write kids' books, fiction, non-fiction. And generally I alternate between them. I have a fiction book, a non-fiction book, a kids' book, not planned. That's just the way my brain seems to work, and rotate around between those. So I'm working on a very big non-fiction book at the moment.
Nice, nice. I love the range there and the things of, or I guess the process of going back and forth and sharing work across forms.
Mm, mm. Yeah. And as I said, I find, overlaps
Yeah.
between them, whether you're writing for a younger audience, whether you're writing for and yeah, non-fiction's predominantly elder males read
Hmm.
non-fiction, and
Hmm.
fiction's predominantly females. So you actually find you're engaging with different people at different styles and levels.
Yeah. Yeah. No, again, thinking about your analytical perspective, I love the way you're thinking through readership in that way too. It's
Mm,
interesting
mm.
to hear. Anything that we've missed in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
I guess a couple of points for people, and I'm imagining a lot of your readers out
Hmm.
there watching this podcast are readers.
Hmm.
When I used to teach at university, teach writing, I'd get the first 5 minutes of every class, I'd get someone to come in and tell us about a book they'd read. And there was no bad genre. Everything was accepted.
Hmm.
And over the course of a term, people would come up and say, that first 5 minutes was my favorite part of the class because people would come and passionately tell me about a book that I would never have read. That was
Hmm.
way outside my comfort zone. That was, something I never thought of. So read outside your comfort zone. Don't just read books that you agree with. Read books you disagree with.
Hmm.
Read
Hmm.
books that sharpen your mind. Reading is about not just a comfort zone, it's about that uncomfort zone as well. And,
Yeah.
read for comfort, sure, but don't forget to read for uncomfort as well.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a conversation, right?
Yeah,
It's an exchange between you and someone that put these ideas down. So love that idea. Yeah. Well, Craig, thank you so much for the time. Glad to have you back anytime to talk
thank you
about
very much.
comics and writing and craft and all the things. And delight to meet you and to share about your work.
My pleasure.